Welcome to Reformed Thinking.
Glad to be here.
So, I want you to imagine holding a legal document that dictates the literal physics of the universe.
Okay.
Every single clause, like every verb tense in this document, actually alters the reality you live in.
Right. It's the rule book.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So if the document says the creator of the universe may punish an infraction, you live in one kind of reality.
A reality where the rules are flexible.
Right, where the judge has the option to just look the other way, where consequences are subject to a daily decision.
Right. It's up in the air.
But if the document says the creator must punish an infraction, everything changes.
Oh, entirely.
You are suddenly living in a universe governed by an absolute unbending moral physics.
There's no looking the other way.
None. So today we are doing a deep dive into a text that argues for that second reality.
A very strict reality.
Yes. We are opening up John Owen's A Dissertation on Divine Justice. We're looking at chapter 12 specifically.
Which is such a dense section.
It really is. Our mission today is to investigate a massive theological dispute about the very nature of God.
Right. Getting to the core of it.
Yeah. Did God choose to punish sin out of his free will, or is punishing sin an absolute inescapable requirement of his very existence?
That is the big question.
Okay, let's unpack this, because that phrasing, that difference between may and must, it changes everything about how we view justice and salvation.
It really does. That distinction between may and must is the hinge upon which entire theological systems turn.
Wow. Okay.
Yeah. We were looking at a moment in the 17th century where John Owen is stepping up to respond to some of the most highly respected theologians of his era.
The heavy hitters?
The absolute heavy hitters. These were men who firmly believed that Christ's satisfaction, the payment made for sin on the cross, was entirely a product of God's free will.
Meaning what, practically?
Meaning they argued that God could have saved humanity a different way. Yeah. He could have demanded a different payment, or perhaps dismissed the penalty altogether without any blood being shed.
So just waved it off.
Basically, yeah. But, they said, he simply chose the cross as his preferred method.
Okay, I see.
Owen's thesis is a direct, systematic strike against that idea. He argues that punitory, sin-avenging justice is not a choice.
So not a choice.
No, it is an essential attribute of God. God punishing sin is as necessary as God being good or God being eternal.
Which places us right in the middle of a high-stakes intellectual conflict.
Oh, absolutely.
And looking at the text, the very first thing that jumps off the page is Owen's posture.
Yeah, his attitude about the whole thing.
Right. You might expect a man of Owen's caliber to come charging onto the field, theological sword drawn, ready to dismantle his opponents.
You'd think so.
But instead, we see massive hesitation.
Yeah, he's very reluctant.
He expresses a genuine reluctance to publicly disagree with these men. He calls them numerous and respectable.
Which is quite a compliment.
And he goes out of his way to highlight how they have benefited the church.
His reluctance is palpable there.
Yeah.
Owen specifically names the Coryphæus of the adversaries.
Coryphæus, what is that?
So, in ancient Greek drama, the Coryphæus was the leader of the chorus, the one who spoke for the group.
Oh, okay.
By using that term, Owen is acknowledging this man as the undisputed intellectual leader, the most prominent voice of the opposing view.
And who is this leader?
That man is the illustrious William Twisse.
William Twisse.
Yes. For context, Twisse was the prolocutor of the Westminster Assembly.
Wait, really?
Yeah. He was the man chosen to chair the most significant theological gathering of the era.
That is a big deal.
It is. Disagreeing with William Twisse in the middle of the 17th century was a massive risk.
I bet.
Owen views himself as someone accustomed to the popular mode of declaiming.
Meaning what? Preaching?
Yes, meaning he is used to preaching to congregations, not standing on the front line as a scholastic debater facing down the recognized champion of European theology.
I want to translate that dynamic into a modern legal setting for you listening.
That's a good way to look at it.
Yeah, like if you are a rookie lawyer or even just a competent trial lawyer, maybe very successful in your local district,
Right.
and you suddenly find yourself filing a brief that directly contradicts a legendary Supreme Court justice.
A justice who wrote the textbooks you studied.
Yes. You are going to hesitate. You risk total professional embarrassment.
Career suicide, basically.
So if Owen feels that level of intimidation, and if he respects Twisse so highly for his contributions to the church, why stick his neck out?
That's the question.
Why not just let this highly academic debate slide and focus on his preaching?
Because truth outranks reputation in Owen's framework. We see a tension in the text between human respect and divine truth.
Yeah.
Owen states that every least particle of divine truth is furnished from heaven with authority.
Every least particle.
Yes. He operates under the conviction that if a disciple of Jesus Christ holds the truth, they must defend it.
No matter what.
Even if the entire academic and theological establishment rises up against them.
Wow.
Modesty is a virtue, sure, but modesty must step aside when the mechanics of salvation are on the line.
He has to speak up.
He feels a religious scruple to hold fast to the truth and enforce its claim. He cannot allow institutional respect to override what he sees as a critical biblical reality.
He actually writes that if modesty must be violated, all will agree it ought to be violated in the cause of truth.
Right.
He knows he is stepping out of his lane. He admits he isn't deserving of even a third or fourth place from the van in this kind of scholastic battle.
And the van refers to the vanguard.
Right, the absolute front line of a military formation taking the heaviest fire.
Yes.
He sees his own abilities way back in the ranks, but he also observes something terrifying.
What's that?
People in his own country are blindly following the authority of these famous theologians without actually weighing the arguments.
That blind reliance on human authority is what forces his hand.
It pushes him over the edge.
Yeah. He realizes that resting on the reputation of an illustrious man like Twisse is leading the church into an intellectual cul-de-sac.
A dead end.
Exactly. So he decides to marshal the line for this controversy.
He steps up.
He assumes that even though his own attempt might be weak or lack the polish of a seasoned scholastic debater, the truth itself is robust enough that impartial readers will see it triumph.
He's trusting the argument.
Yes, he is relying on the weight of the argument, not the resume of the author.
Which indicates the subject matter is not a minor semantic squabble.
Not at all.
If a man who prefers preaching is willing to risk his reputation against the top scholars of his day, the underlying issue must carry massive implications.
Huge implications.
This brings us to the core theological dispute, the tension between God's will and God's nature.
Right.
What is surprising when you read the primary sources is that both sides in this dispute actually agree on quite a bit of the fundamental theology.
They do. It is crucial to map out the common ground before we analyze the division.
So what do they agree on?
Both sides agree entirely on the satisfaction of Jesus Christ as revealed in Scripture.
Okay, so the cross.
Yes. They agree that Jesus died, paid the penalty, and satisfied the wrath of God. They also agree that God willed the salvation of sinners.
So the history isn't disputed.
No. Furthermore, they even agree that sin-avenging justice is natural to God. They are operating within the same orthodox framework regarding the historical events of the crucifixion.
Wait, if they agree that justice is natural to God and they agree the cross happened, where is the actual fight?
The exact point of division rests on the word necessity.
Necessity.
Yes. The opponents, led by Twisse, argue the necessity of Christ's satisfaction flowed purely from the most free will of God.
Meaning God chose to make it necessary.
Right. In their scholastic system, God agreed to punish sin this way because he simply willed it to be so, not because his underlying nature demanded it.
They want to protect God's choices.
They want to protect God's absolute freedom of choice at all costs.
So what does this all mean? Let's ground this in a practical analogy for you listening.
Okay, let's hear it.
Is God's justice like a human judge who sits on the bench, looks at a guilty person, and has the authority to choose to dismiss the fine out of kindness?
A judge with discretion.
Yeah. A human judge has free will in that moment. They can say, you broke the law, but I'm going to waive the penalty.
Right.
Or is God's justice like gravity, like a fundamental law of reality that cannot simply be turned off or ignored, even by the one who created it?
The gravity analogy captures the essence of Owen's position perfectly.
Does it?
Yeah, if justice is an essential nature of God, it operates with the inescapable reality of physics.
It just happens.
God cannot deny himself. Therefore, if a sin occurs, it must be punished. There is no alternative reality where the sin simply evaporates.
Okay.
Twisse and the opponents are arguing for the human judge scenario. They believe God could have saved humans without the cross if he had chosen to do so.
He just happened to pick the cross.
He just happened to choose the cross as the mechanism. Owen fiercely opposes this, arguing the necessity arises from the very nature of divine justice.
That shifts the entire reading of the New Testament.
It really does.
If Twisse is right, the crucifixion was just one option on a menu of possible ways God could have handled human rebellion.
Option A, option B.
Right. He could have chosen option B or option C. But if Owen is right, the cross was the only mathematically and legally possible way to save humans without God violating his own internal character.
Owen sets up a rigid, immovable framework.
Okay.
In his view, if God is going to save sinners, the events of the New Testament had to happen specifically the way they did.
There was no other path.
Right. The blood had to be shed. The penalty had to be paid.
Wow.
Not because God arbitrarily decided that was the rule for Tuesday, but because God's own holiness and justice require propitiation. His nature dictates the action.
To understand why this debate became so intense and why a brilliant man like Twisse took the position he did, we have to look at the historical catalyst.
Yes, the background.
Theological debates don't happen in a vacuum. The text mentions that the writings of a man named Arminius set this whole controversy in motion.
Arminius is the spark here.
Let's talk about that.
Well, Arminius wrote extensively concerning the efficacy of Christ's death, and his views caused a massive disruption in the theological landscape of the time.
What was his main point?
Arminius contended that Christ's satisfaction only accomplished one specific thing.
Which was?
It made it so God might pardon sinners if he willed to do so, consistently with his honor.
Let's break down the mechanics of that argument.
Sure.
Arminius is saying the cross didn't actually secure salvation for anyone specific.
Right.
It just opened a door. It made humanity savable.
Savable, yes.
In this legal framework, the cross created a condition where God is now allowed to forgive people without losing face, but it doesn't guarantee he will forgive any individual person.
That is an accurate assessment of the Arminian system.
Okay.
The cross removes a legal barrier, but the actual salvation of a person depends on a secondary condition.
Like what?
Usually their own choice to believe or their own faith.
I see.
Twisse looked at this opinion and was horrified. Yes. The text notes Twisse considered this opinion absurd and highly derogatory to divine grace and the merit of Christ.
He hated it.
Twisse wanted nothing to do with the idea that the Son of God suffered that level of agony simply to create a mere possibility of forgiveness.
Okay, here's the logical puzzle.
What's that?
If Twisse hated Arminius' view so intensely and thought it insulted the cross, why is Owen arguing with Twisse? Aren't Twisse and Owen on the exact same side of the theological aisle here? They both want to defeat the Arminian view.
They share the same desired outcome, yes.
So why fight?
But they're using entirely different and incompatible weapons to fight the battle.
Oh, I get it.
Twisse tried to fight Arminius by elevating God's free will above everything else.
Okay.
This is a framework known as voluntarism, where God's will is the supreme governing attribute.
So Twisse leaned into the free will aspect.
He thought the best way to crush Arminius was to say, God's free will is the only factor in salvation. He saves who he wills, and he punishes who he wills, purely by his own sovereign choice, unconstrained by anything.
And I see the strategy.
Yeah.
Twisse thought if he argued that God must punish sin based on a rigid law, he would somehow be agreeing with the Arminians, who also had rules about what God could and couldn't do.
Twisse was terrified of putting God in a box.
Right. He wanted a God who was absolutely free from any necessity.
As the exact dynamic driving twist.
It's fascinating.
We see complex theological factions forming in the text. Arminius is the main champion of his view, but he has followers who refine his arguments.
Like who?
The text mentions Coryphæus, whose opinion introduces slight variations.
Okay.
And Episcopius, who is described as the new Coryphæus of the Arminian cause.
Another Coryphæus.
Yeah, acting as a very noble champion for their side. Then there is the Pelagian tribe, who the text notes became reconciled with the Socinians.
Wait, we need to unpack who the Socinians are.
Definitely.
Because they represent the extreme logical end of this debate. The Socinians denied the satisfaction of Christ entirely, didn't they?
They did. Faustus Socinus argued that a debt cannot be both paid and forgiven.
Oh, that's an interesting angle.
If I owe you money and someone else pays it, you haven't forgiven my debt. You simply collected it from another source.
Right. The debt was paid, not forgiven.
Therefore, Socinus argued, if God truly forgives, there can be no payment, no cross, no satisfaction.
Wow.
The text points out that the Socinians wouldn't even use Arminius' arguments.
Why not?
Because they thought his weapon, the idea that Christ satisfied God's honor to make forgiveness possible, would cut the throat of their own desperate cause.
They just threw out the whole concept.
They rejected the concept of satisfaction altogether.
So we are looking at a massive intellectual battlefield.
A huge one.
You have the Arminians saying Christ made salvation a possibility.
Yep.
You have the Socinians saying Christ didn't offer satisfaction at all, reducing the cross to a moral example. You have Twisse trying to defend orthodox theology by shouting that everything is based on God's absolute, unconstrained free will.
Exactly.
And then Owen walks onto the field, assesses the situation, and says to Twisse, "You are using the wrong weapon. Your defense is actually compromising the foundation."
And this leads to a brilliant pivot by Owen.
How so?
Twisse had suggested that Owen's strict view of justice, the idea that God must punish sin, actually contributed to the support of Arminianism.
Twisse thought Owen was helping the other side.
Yeah. Twisse thought that if you lock God into a system of necessary justice, you were playing right into the hands of the opponents.
And Owen completely flips this script.
He does.
He takes Twisse's accusation and turns it upside down, using the concept of definite atonement.
It's so clever.
Here's where it gets really interesting.
Yeah.
Owen asks a rhetorical question in the text.
What's the question?
If Christ effected that God might forgive sins, does that mean Christ accomplished nothing farther? And Owen answers his own question, God forbid.
Let's examine the rigorous logic Owen deploys here.
Yeah, lay it out.
Owen argues that if God, by his very nature, cannot but punish sin, then he absolutely must punish it.
No exceptions?
There are no exceptions, no loopholes, no dismissed cases. However, if Christ offered himself as an oblation, a substitutionary sacrifice for specific sins, those specific sins have now been punished in full.
Right.
He references Romans chapter 3, verses 23 through 26, which outlines Christ acting as a propitiation to declare God's righteousness.
The legal mechanics here are fascinating.
They really are.
If justice is strict and unbending and Christ steps in and takes the full punishment for a specific set of sins, those sins are legally dealt with.
The ledger is completely balanced.
Therefore, God cannot punish those sins again.
He cannot.
To do so would violate the strict right and justice of God. It is the theological equivalent of the legal concept of double jeopardy in modern jurisprudence.
That's a great comparison.
You cannot be tried, convicted, and punished twice for the exact same crime. It violates the very nature of justice.
That legal framing perfectly captures Owen's argument.
Okay.
If God's justice is an essential part of his nature, it demands payment. Once the payment is rendered in full by Christ, justice itself demands the release of the debtor.
God is legally bound by his own righteous nature to forgive the person whose sins were paid for on the cross.
It is no longer a matter of God looking down and deciding to be kind.
Right.
It is a matter of God's unyielding justice requiring the release of the prisoner because the sentence has been served.
Owen writes that God is more bound in strict right and injustice in respect of Jesus Christ to confer grace and glory on all those for whom he died.
Which is a powerful statement.
That completely destroys the Arminian idea of a mere possibility of salvation.
It shatters the Arminian framework entirely.
Yeah.
If the Arminians say the cross only made salvation possible, Owen replies that a strictly just God who receives a full infinite payment cannot offer a mere possibility of release.
It has to be guaranteed.
A full payment guarantees release. It makes the cross an absolute guaranteed transaction.
So it's not just a potential thing.
No, the blood of Christ doesn't just open a door or create a favorable condition. It actually purchases specific people and secures their grace and glory irrevocably.
This demonstrates why Owen believes his view is the ultimate weapon against Arminianism, not a liability.
Right.
If you believe God's justice absolutely requires punishment, and Jesus took that exact punishment, then salvation is a done deal for those he represented.
It's mathematically certain.
Yeah. Twisse's free will argument looks flimsy and uncertain compared to the absolute certain guarantee of Owen's justice argument.
Owen is essentially telling Twisse, you don't need to protect God's free will to defeat the Arminians.
You just need to correctly understand the mechanics of God's justice.
Exactly. And as Owen presses this point further, he notices a glaring flaw in Twisse's own published writings.
Oh man, this brings us to a moment that feels like a mic drop in the text.
It really does.
Owen points out a fatal contradiction in Twisse's logic.
What did he find?
The text notes that Twisse actually maintains, in his other writings, that punitory, sin-avenging justice is natural to God.
Yes, he does.
Twisse even voted in favor of this specific idea when he was arguing against other adversaries like Piscator and Libertus.
He's on the record.
He eloquently defended the idea that justice is an essential attribute of the divine nature.
We need to look closely at the definition of justice provided in the text to understand the trap here.
Okay, what is the definition?
Justice is defined as a constant will of punishing every sin according to the rule of his right.
A constant will.
Yes, Twisse agrees with this definition in print. He grants that an immutably constant will of punishing every sin is natural to God.
Wait, if Twisse grants that God has an immutably constant will to punish every sin, how can Twisse possibly argue, as he does against Owen, that God could choose not to punish it?
It is a direct logical contradiction.
It makes no sense.
You cannot possess an immutably constant will to do something and simultaneously possess the free will to choose not to do it.
Because it's supposed to be constant.
Immutably constant means it never changes, it never wavers, it is always in effect. If it is constant, there is no moment where the will decides to choose the opposite.
I have to pause here.
Sure.
If Twisse is the undisputed intellectual leader of his day, the man who chaired the Westminster Assembly.
The Coryphæus.
Right. How does he miss a contradiction this obvious? How does a genius make a mistake like that in a published disputation? Is it a blind spot?
It happens frequently in complex scholastic systems when theologians try to synthesize competing philosophical frameworks.
What framework was Twisse using?
Twisse was heavily influenced by the Scotus tradition.
Following Duns Scotus.
Yes, which placed massive weight on the absolute power of God, the potentia absoluta.
Okay, absolute power.
Twisse was so hyper-focused on protecting God's absolute freedom of choice because he thought that was the only way to safeguard divine sovereignty against Arminius.
So he compartmentalized it.
He created a firewall between God's nature and God's actions.
Ah, I see.
He wanted to say, yes, God's nature is perfectly just, but his actions in history are dictated purely by his free will, which is not bound by necessity.
But Owen refuses to let him separate who God is from what God does.
You won't let him do it.
Owen simply asks the rhetorical question, who hath opposed his will?
Right.
If it is God's constant will to punish, it will happen. You cannot dissect God into parts where his free will overrides his essential nature.
God acts according to who he is.
His actions are the outward expression of his internal essence.
Owen's logic is relentless on this point. If God is just, he must do justice. He cannot deny himself.
It's airtight.
Twisse tried to have it both ways, maintaining a just nature in theory, but a free choice regarding punishment in practice.
And Owen exposed the seams in that argument.
He really did. He showed that Twisse's system required God to act against his own constant will.
Which is a theological impossibility.
Exactly.
Identifying a flaw is one thing, but completely dismantling a respected opponent's published work requires a systematic plan.
You need a roadmap.
Right. Owen doesn't just want to point out a contradiction and walk away. He wants to dismantle Twisse's entire disputation piece by piece.
And the text outlines Twisse's disputation to show specifically what Owen is up against.
How is it structured?
It is divided into two parts. The first part contains 4 principal arguments attacking the idea that God cannot, without a satisfaction, forgive sin.
Okay.
The second part is where Twisse answers arguments from 2 other theologians, Piscator and Libertus, adding his own new arguments along the way.
Owen mentions another figure here, the judicious Maccovius.
Ah, yes.
Who is Maccovius, and how does he fit into this intellectual fight?
Johannes Maccovius was a Polish theologian who taught in Friesland. He was a predecessor in this debate.
So he was already fighting this fight?
Yes, a very sharp, sometimes aggressive scholastic thinker who was present at the Synod of Dort.
Oh, wow.
The text notes that Maccovius had already given solid and perspicuous, meaning clear answers to Twisse's 4 principal arguments.
So he already handled Twisse's main points.
Maccovius had already done a lot of the heavy lifting in refuting Twisse's voluntarist position.
Okay, so if Maccovius already answered Twisse, why is Owen writing a book about it?
Good question.
Why not just hand people the writings of Maccovius, point to the clear answers, and save himself the trouble of going up against the Coryphæus?
Owen addresses that directly. First, he feels the plan of his own work requires him to tackle Twisse personally to build a complete system of divine justice.
Okay, that makes sense.
Second, and more importantly, he notes that while Maccovius was solid, he may not have satisfied readers in every particular detail.
He left some gaps.
Maccovius might have left a few logical loopholes. And in scholastic theology, a single loophole is disastrous.
Why is that?
Because it allows factions like the Socinians to enter and dismantle the entire doctrine of the atonement.
Oh, they'll just exploit the gap.
Exactly.
Owen is obsessed with absolute airtight clarity.
He has to be.
He tells the reader that he wants to add things so that this controversy with Twisse will occasion no trouble to anyone for the future.
He wants to settle it permanently.
He wants to drive a stake through the heart of the argument so that no future student of theology ever has to be confused by it again.
That level of thoroughness defines the Reformed scholastic method.
Leave no stone unturned.
You don't just win the argument on points. You anticipate every possible counter-argument, every potential misunderstanding, and you dismantle those as well.
Right.
Owen calls Twisse a veteran leader, so well trained to the scholastic field. Twisse has pointed out the way, setting the terms and definitions of the debate.
And now Owen is going to follow him onto that battlefield.
And engage him on his own terms.
Owen outlines his specific weapons for this battle. He says he will try Twisse's arguments by the rule of Scripture and right reason.
Yes.
That phrase is a perfect summary of the standard of truth for this era of theology.
It is the bedrock of the approach.
How does that work in practice?
You start with a biblical text. That is the supreme authority, as Owen noted earlier when he talked about every particle of divine truth coming from heaven.
Right, but it's not just quoting verses.
No, you don't stop with simply quoting verses out of context. You apply right reason.
Which means rigorous logic.
Rigorous logic, syllogisms, and careful deductions to ensure your interpretation of the Scripture is consistent.
It has to make sense.
It has to be coherent, and it cannot contradict other known truths about God's nature.
So, despite his initial modesty and his stated reluctance, Owen is now marching onto the battlefield.
He's fully committed now.
He is fully prepared to demonstrate to all impartial judges that Twisse has failed to prove his point.
He is ready to systematically break down every one of Twisse's arguments.
Using the biblical text and unassailable logic,
He's confident that the truth will triumph.
even if he feels outmatched on paper.
He knows his own abilities might be lesser than Twisse's in terms of formal debate experience or institutional standing.
Right.
But because he holds the truth of God's essential justice, he believes the arguments will stand on their own merit.
We have covered a massive amount of theological ground today.
It's a lot to process.
Let's summarize the stakes. This dispute between Owen and Twisse was not an academic spat over minor definitions.
No, it was central to
It
everything.
was a battle over whether the cross was an optional plan or the absolute logically necessary requirement of an unfailingly just God.
The implications stretch into every corner of theology.
Really? How so?
Well, if you side with Twisse, God's will is supreme, but his justice is flexible.
Okay.
But if you side with Owen, God's justice is an immovable rock, and the cross was the only possible way for a holy God to redeem a fallen humanity without compromising his own character.
It makes the events of Calvary an absolute necessity of cosmic law.
Yes, not an arbitrary choice.
I want to leave you with a final thought to mull over, one that steps outside the theological boundaries of the 17th century and touches on how we view reality today.
Okay.
We live in a post-Enlightenment world where we often view laws and rules as arbitrary constructs of authority.
Right, like a speed limit.
Yeah, a speed limit is just a number a city council decided on. It could easily be changed tomorrow.
Someone just made it up.
We project that view onto the universe, assuming that any authority, even divine authority, is just exercising arbitrary power.
That's a very modern mindset.
But if Owen is right, if God's justice is an essential, immovable attribute that absolutely requires payment for every infraction,
Then what?
then reality itself is grounded in a moral physics that even God will not alter.
Wow.
If the universe operates on a fundamental law of justice that is as real and unbending as the law of gravity, how does that reframe the way you view the reliability of the reality you live in?
It changes everything.
If the rules aren't arbitrary but are the reflection of an eternal nature, the universe is a much more serious and perhaps a much more secure place than we often imagine.
That is a lot to think about.
It really is. Thank you for joining this session of Reformed Thinking. Keep questioning the text and keep seeking the truth.